Aloha, and welcome to our presentation on the novel His Hawaiian Excellency, written in 1987 by Niklaus R. Schweizer. My name is Robin Shirley, and I'm going to be starting us off with our presentation, specifically on author and historical background. So to start off, I want to give you a world map of Schweizer's life. So he started on the west coast of Europe in Zurich, Switzerland. This is where he was born and where he got his first initial degrees in English, German, and colonial history. Zurich, Switzerland is definitely talked about a lot in this novel. So when you do go through the lectures and when you do read the novel, I recommend kind of looking out for that buzzword city. After he got his initial degrees, he moved on to California for his PhD, where he attended UC Davis. He got his PhD in English, and then even further westward, he moved on to Oahu in Hawaii, where he taught German initially at Punahou, and then moved on to be a professor at UH Manoa, circa the 1970s. So on our next slide here, you will see a picture of Dr. Schweizer. Again, he was born in Switzerland on August 24th, 1939. Started off in Zurich and then got his PhD in the United States. When he did move on to UH Manoa and he became a professor, he wanted to focus on the German contributions to Hawaii and also the European presence in the Pacific. And actually, he did teach multiple sections of the course that we're currently in. So it's kind of cool to talk about a man who knows exactly what we're learning about right now. He seems like a super well-rounded person. He speaks so many European languages, but then also Hawaiian and Tahitian, which I think is very important if you are going to be a professor of Hawaiian studies. He's also currently an active member in numerous community organizations, including serving on the board of the Friends of Iolani Palace. He's the president of the Friends of Royal Hawaiian Band, and he's on the board of Ahahui Kauilani. So let's move on to a little bit of historical background about what's going on during the time of the book publishing. So this is not the same as the book's timeline. So during the book, it happens in the 1800s, but obviously Dr. Schweizer had to write it during the 80s, so quite far forward in the future for him. But during the 1980s, Schweizer had a realization that nobody really knew how Hawaii came to be how it is currently as a United States state, our 50th state, and how it went from a monarchy, a kingdom, to statehood. And so he decided to take initiative, drafted a couple pages, and showed it to a Kanaka woman. And after kind of proofreading it, she mentioned to him that, like, hey, you should visit this Iokea family because Curtis Iokea was actually a diplomat. So Schweizer went to the kin of Curtis Iokea. Obviously, they have the same name, but we're talking about the great-grandson who had a shop down in Waikiki selling like boogie boards and surfboards to like travelers. So he went to Iokea and was like, hey, do you know anything about, your great-grandfather? And so this Iokea said, hey, yeah, you should talk to my dad, because he was actually someone who worked really closely with the man you're speaking of. So Schweizer went on an airplane and flew all the way to Maui, found the father to which the grandson was referring, and the father actually had physical memoirs from Curtis Iokea, who we speak about in this novel, and gave it to Schweizer. And so from these just beautiful historical documents, Schweizer added additional research, added fictional elements to kind of keep reader interest, and in 1987 published His Hawaiian Excellency. So moving on from Schweizer's backgrounds during this time, during the 1980s, I do want to talk about what was occurring in Hawaii as a state. So post-statehood, approximately 1959, 1960, Hawaii had what was known as the Hawaiian Renaissance. So this was pretty much a rebirth of Hawaiian culture, almost to kind of stick it to the man in a very passive, lovely Hawaiian way. So it was not a celebration. It was not a celebration of annexation. It was not a celebration of statehood. It was a way to passively rebel by ensuring the longevity of Kanaka culture, basically showing like you can annex our islands, you can call us American, but deep down we are all Hawaiian, and so we are going to live the Hawaiian way. So when did this happen? Again, around the 1960s. It was a renewed excitement surrounding their culture. And then let's get into really why this happened. So there were two real motives. The initial one was a political motive to show a united front against colonizers, regardless of the fact that they were just recently annexed. And then there was a cultural motive to really reignite the pride of Kanaka, to really reignite, wanting to practice hula, to speak the Hawaiian language, and to bring back traditions that had been banned and been hidden from their generations of suppression from missionaries and other laws. So this was a way to save their culture through a rebirthing culture. A real point of contention is kind of what happened next. So really what changed because of the Hawaiian Renaissance. And there's really two sides to it, the good and the bad side. So I'll start with the good. The good things were that Hawaiian was taught in schools, Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian ways of planting, and like lohi patches, and teaching about the taro plant, and basically things that were neglected in the past were now brought to fruition and brought back into schools, especially for young Hawaiians. And then also a musical rebirth really happened. One example is slack key music styles. And this music style really showed a powerful side, a more rebellious, powerful side to what Howleys and others had explained as, soft, appealing music sounds. This was Kanaka way of showing, like, we are so much more than that. And then, of course, there's the bad side, which started with the United States claiming religious lands. So a lot of issues in this story begin with the United States, kind of still happens currently, but Kahalawe is a cultural site, which was originally kind of, founded by Kanaka as early as 400 CE, so extremely old and extremely important. It was used as a main navigational center for these Polynesians, also a site for religious ceremonies, and a burial ground for Kanaka Uiwi for their ancestors. And this site that was so important and so revered was basically taken by the United States Navy and used as a bomb test site for nuclear bombs, mortars, and other artillery. And this occurred from 1953 until around 1980, so almost 3 decades of just tearing up this religious site. It was not until 2003 when the state of Hawaii was finally able to start trying to restore and salvage whatever they could from this land. But this was something really bad that happened during this period of Hawaiian Renaissance.
Hi, I'm Janice Winona Alcalde, and I'll be going over the setting and synopsis. So to start, we have an overview of the places mentioned throughout the book, but the story itself takes place at Mauna Ala in 1938. Our main character, Iwakea, attends Queen Liliuokalani's 100th birthday celebration, and during the ceremony, he starts having flashbacks, and his mind starts to wander to all these other places that he's visited throughout his lifetime. And the first place is Moscow. Iwakea and his secretary Henry Poor are sent by King Kalakaua to attend Alexander III's coronation and represent Hawaii. And so much happens during their time there, so for the sake of our time, we can focus on the underlying point. The takeaway from this section, arguably, is the fact that the Secretary of the English Embassy implies that Hawaii is an American colony. Henry Poor goes to see Mr. Kennedy and asks about Russian customs, and Mr. Kennedy happily answers, except that he also wonders why Poor came to him instead of the American embassy. Poor goes back and relays this information to Iwakea, who believes that this comment was made because of the Reciprocity Treaty, which was the economic agreement between Hawaii and the US to send each other goods tariff-free. The problem with this treaty is that America had the upper hand in it, and Iwakea believed that the two countries would eventually renegotiate the terms, but for the time being, this treaty gave Hawaii a very questionable international reputation. Henry Poor actually goes as far as to blame the missionaries for it, whereas Iwakea is quick to dismiss him. And that scene essentially sets up the tone for the rest of the book. The next city the two travel to is St. Petersburg, and during his time there, Iwakea meets with the Russian Foreign Minister von Giers, and in the Russian Foreign Minister's office there's a globe to which Iwakea seeks out Hawaii on. It's standing isolated and independent, but once again that independence is brought into question because before Iwakea leaves, the Foreign Minister just casually mentions that America has a lot to settle on the continent right now, but once it does, it's very interested in expanding west. Other points to consider from this section are the Odyssey and capital. So during the train ride there, Henry Poor is reading the Odyssey and Iwakea is interested in it but not yet ready to read it. But spoiler alert, he eventually does, and that carries importance later on in the book. The second point to consider is this concept of a capital. So another foreign diplomat, von Lambsdorff, invites Iwakea to one of his dinner parties, and after dinner, these Russian gentlemen start debating what determines a capital. Should it be tied to a state's geography? Should it be in the center of a state? Or should it be tied to a state's authority? And should it be tied to a state's monarch? Or just power? And once again, that also comes up later in the book. The next place we sail off to is the Suez Canal. On the ship, Iwakea befriends a man he calls Pseudo Kitchener because he actually doesn't know his real identity. Kitchener is the man that people believe this man to be, and he's not correcting anyone. It's beneficial for this man to keep his identity anonymous, but Iwakea does know that he is English. The two start to talk about the missionaries and their origins, and as an Englishman, the Pseudo Kitchener is not a fan of the missionaries. Iwakea starts to describe their involvement in Hawaii and how they came to the islands, and as they're having this conversation, Pseudo Kitchener keeps saying, fire, brimstone, and money. If we were to break down the phrase, fire and brimstone actually comes from the Bible and it relates to hell, and money is money. And so these are two things, punishment for the wicked and capitalism, that drive Calvinists. It may have been because of his own disdain for Calvinists or because Pseudo Kitchener, in his own way, was trying to warn Iwakea of their actual intentions. Once again, Iwakea was quick to dismiss the idea and even went so far as to defend them, which sadly we can use as a segue to the next section of the book, which is a very detailed account of the overthrow. Queen Liliuokalani wants to pass her new constitution, which would move the power from the legislature back to the monarchy, basically undoing everything that the Bayonet Constitution did. She can't get the support for this because the USS Boston, which is an American naval ship, is stationed right outside the government building. After Queen Liliuokalani's address, the Annexation Club, which is later known as the Committee of Safety, meets at the law office and devises a plan to make sure that this constitution is never put into place. Lauren Thurston is the committee member who thinks of the plan to enlist the USS Boston for help. And between their military power and their volunteer militia, they're able to overtake Honolulu. They declare martial law and set up their provisional government, to which Sanford Dole is the president of. And during all of this, Queen Liliuokalani is meeting with her advisors, and by this point, Iwakea has finished the Odyssey, as this event takes place almost 12 years after St. Petersburg. So the Queen presents him with the two monsters from the book, and Iwakea picks up that she's really asking him if she should take on the Annexation Club or the USS Boston. They all decide that by taking on the USS Boston, it would be implied that Hawaii is actually declaring war on the US. So the Queen decides to submit to the Safety Committee as it's the lesser of the two evils. A few years later, Iwakea travels back to London, where he once was about 10 years ago, to attend Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. And every underlined point in the past slides has led up to this quote. Now tell me, Colonel, was it really necessary? In every city that Iwakea has visited, there has been someone, whether a politician or a soldier or a pseudo person, to warn him about the actual and true intentions of the missionaries, and yet not only did he ignore those warnings, but he also joined the missionaries later on. He's sent to London by Sanford Dole. So naturally, he's incredibly embarrassed by this encounter and does everything in his power to bring himself back to the Mauna Ala. The book ends with Iwakea reflecting on the past 40 years and describing all the changes after the annexation. And then we circle back to the two ideas from earlier, the first being the capital of Hawaii. Honolulu holds a lot of economic importance because it has the only natural harbor in the islands, and because at the time, whichever city had the most economic importance also had the most political power. But while Honolulu is the capital because it holds the most Hawaiian life, we should also ask if it holds the most Hawaiian spirit. And that goes to the second point, which is that, one, Professor Schweitzer does a marvelous job of referencing the Odyssey throughout the book, but two, he beautifully ties it all together and saves the best for the very last. Iwakea remembers the part of the book where Odysseus is traveling from the sea inland and he's carrying an oar, and the people who have never seen the sea because they live inland ask him why he's carrying a fan. This speaks to the Hawaiian experience because the Hawaiian identity is very complex and complicated, and even though all these countries and honestly even Hawaiians themselves may see themselves as something they're not because of all the re-education that happened in those 40 years, it will never change the fact that they are not actually a winning fan, but an oar. And Robin will talk about this later on, but Iwakea earlier in the book had a dream which ended in him seeing 3 rainbows, and when he steps out of Queen Liliuokalani's gravesite, he also sees 3 rainbows, and that really solidifies his hope in Hawaii's future and establishing Pono, which is a balance between justice and harmony. And he really believes that the islands and its people can reach that by building and uplifting community and really spreading the true spirit of aloha.
The last section I personally really want to get into is going to be the themes of our novel, His Hawaiian Excellency. And in the title it even mentions that it is the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and the annexation of Hawaii. So we want to talk about the themes within this book, as if the title is not self-explanatory. The first one is what I call the unheeded warning. So the far right side shows a picture of David Malo, who was a Maui-based Hawaiian philosopher who had a real disliking to haoles, which, we kind of can understand why. And he had one specific prophecy, which I have it up here in Hawaiian, but I'm going to read in English. And it roughly translates to, "These people will rebel, not they themselves, but their children and grandchildren. The chief who will live then will be deprived of power, and the government which will be set up will be the permanent government of Hawaii." So what Malo is trying to say is that there will be an uprising, there will be a different government. What we have now is comfortable, but it will not last. And throughout the novel, Iwakea really struggles with people telling him that, the kingdom, the monarchy of Hawaii is not going to stay this way. And his partner, Henry Poor, who is also a diplomat, mentions to him in the novel, specifically on page 35, saying that Iwakea is too trusting. You believe the missionaries and you think our king can handle them. Basically saying that Iwakea has this blind faith in the king when there's so many, evidential things that are telling everybody, these missionaries are bad. They're in Hawaii and they have a motive. They're not here for peace. And kind of the third strike on Iwakea's behalf is his dream. So in this scene, Iwakea is in Russia attending the Tsar's coronation, and he has this horrifying nightmare with three parts to it. So there's an image of the Russian Tsar where he's on fire, everything around him is on fire, and then it pans to this like ocean of blood everywhere where this mysterious Hawaiian lady dressed in black is kneeling and praying to a god, but is overtaken by the sea of blood, and then everything like whooshes away, and there's this triple rainbow, and Iwakea like wakes up and is just so bothered, and this happened to occur right after his chat with Henry Poor, where, Poor had mentioned Malo's prophecy and mentioned that he's too trusting of these missionaries, and it kind of shows Iwakea like, you need to wake up, like you need to see what's happening to Hawaii. The last theme that I think is so important in this novel is what I'm going to call the racist expansion. So as we know, colonization worldwide was a huge issue, especially when it came to small islands in the Pacific, including Hawaii. And really it comes down to this racist expectation that America and these big powers like Russia and Britain and France and everybody, they're so much bigger and so much better than this kingdom. And in the novel, Henry Poor is talking to Iwakea and mentions about America's view of Hawaii and the Calvinist missionaries' view of Hawaii, and says to him, to them, our culture was primitive, if not downright evil. It had to be suppressed. Their sons and grandsons inherited their biased point of view. So he's basically telling Iwakea, like I said in the last slide, these missionaries that are in our islands, they're not here for good things. They're here for taking us over. And then after kind of really sitting on Poor's words, Iwakea remembers a specific time when the king had the hula kahiko dance, and this was played during ceremony, and Iwakea remembers specifically how he's like shielding their eyes from this beautiful celebrational dance. And the next day, missionary papers were mentioning these pagan practices and making them seem so horrible and evil, and mentioning the cost of the coronation, how it was too high. And another big thing was the Annexation Club, which was a conspirator against the crown. It's all these sons and grandsons of missionaries, and their ideas would never pass in Hawaiian legislation, so they thought, okay, well, I guess I better overthrow the government, which again just fulfills this manifest destiny of westward expansion, which just pulls off of this racist expansionist ideal. The last person is going to be Sanford Dole, who started off as a friend to the Queen, but then completely did a 180 and betrayed the throne. He resigned as a justice hours before the overthrow, and then became the president of the provincial government. So this just shows that racist people were in power and that there was really no way out of it. And just this foreshadowing for Iwakea, where he honestly had no idea that any of this was going to happen.
Hey guys, it's Winona again, and now we get to talk about the ethics of the characters. And the most objective way to do so would be to take their ethical behavior and then compare it to a value. So for this set of characters, we chose loyalty. And in theory, loyalty can lead someone towards ethical behavior. It's just that none of these characters had loyalty towards Hawaii. That's not to say they didn't respect Hawaii as a country. It's just that their involvement or lack of involvement in the overthrow and then their inaction following the overthrow can really just be boiled down to the fact that they had loyalty towards their own country and their own country's interest. So we can take that idea of loyalty and apply it to these next set of characters, but also add justice into the mix. And the problem with justice is that it gets a little tricky. The main difference between ethics and justice is that ethics focuses on an individual's behavior, whereas justice focuses on a society's behavior or society's belief on how to behave. And because of that, justice feeds into the legal system of that time. And what makes this complicated is that these three characters wanted to change the political landscape of their country and rewrite the legal system and laws. I didn't mention Tanya Strelnikova during the synopsis, but she was a Russian woman who was a part of the People's Freedom Party, also known as the Nihilist Group. She ties into the story because she has a romance going on with Henry Poor, and because the Nihilist Group is supposed to parallel the Committee of Safety in that both these organizations want to end the monarchy of their country. So when legality becomes a gray area, we can fall back onto morality. The only problem with that is that there's no way to standardize our assessment of how these characters held up their own moral systems. What we can say about this group, however, is that they all had a very strong loyalty towards their own sense of justice. So what do you guys think? Do you think that in this case justice trumps loyalty, or is it the other way around? For all the characters that have been mentioned so far, each one of them is an incredibly strong patriot. It's just that their sense of justice may drive them to show their loyalty towards their country a little differently. And when we think about what people do in the name of their country, we also have to think about their own sense of duty, which brings us to our last group of characters. And for this last slide, we can actually work backwards and start with Queen Liliuokalani. As we were saying earlier, when legality becomes a gray area, we can always fall onto morality. And she displays this pretty gracefully when she's imprisoned and the justice system of Hawaii is pretty up in the air, because it's then that she allows her Christian morals to drive her behavior. In fact, all of these characters face an ethical dilemma when they need to decide how to proceed after their duty had been threatened. In Henry Poor's case, he actually contemplates sacrificing his sense of duty to go see about a gal. Truthfully, there's not too much to say about the decision he made, but we can speak to the fact that him acting freely was in of itself practicing ethics, and I guess you could apply that to all the other characters. We could even say that Henry Poor was the only character of these 9 to have true freedom when practicing his ethical decision-making, because then we can look at a character like our last one, Iaukeia, and think about what drove him to join the provisional government. Iaukeia didn't have to consider his political duty as much as his familial duty, and those held him to conditions that Poor didn't have. In the book, Iaukeia even mentions how royalists, or those who opposed the new government, lost their jobs and lost their homes, and so as a father and husband, was it ethical for him to act in loyalty to his family? We talked about justice being tied to the legal system and how that was a gray area at the time, so if he hit his duty and he hit loyalty, does it make that action ethical, even if it doesn't move towards justice or towards a sense of justice that we can compare to now? It's challenging not to talk about ethics without getting very philosophical, so I will leave you guys with the basic formula, which is that we can analyze a character's ethics by comparing their behavior to the ethical systems of their time and environment and seeing if they uphold them. And that's important to consider because our own initial reactions to all of these characters are driven by our ethical standards.
Hello everyone, I'm Kahala and I will be going over the remaining 4 sections, starting with characterizations. Curtis Iaukeia is the main character of this novel. He is a young Hawaiian diplomat who is dedicated to the monarchy. He served under both King Kalakaua and Queen Liliuokalani. Curtis Iaukeia goes around the world representing Hawaii and its monarchy, attending historical events such as the coronation of the Tsar Alexander III in Russia and Queen Victoria's jubilees in London, both her golden 50th jubilee and her diamond 60th jubilee. In the novel, Iaukeia represents Hawaii so well that he surprises a lot of people with his ability to speak well and hold his own amongst other nobles, something that a lot of other nobles hadn't expected from someone coming from the middle of the Pacific and such a small kingdom. In the novel, Iaukeia struggles with the events occurring that changes Hawaii's future, and continues such struggle through the entire novel all the way until the end. Henry Poor is the counterpart and secretary to Curtis Iokea. He was a diplomatic secretary, so he too served the monarchy. Mr. Poor is very skeptical about the missionaries' children and tries to warn Iokea about this. Throughout the novel, Poor is constantly questioning the foreign businessmen and their intentions, but his voice isn't heard well enough until it was too late. Tanya is a Russian nihilist, part of the group who opposes the Russian regime, including the Tsar. Tanya is a fictitious character, and so since we don't have a picture of her since she's fiction, I put the flag of Russia, representing the Russian nihilists. I wondered why Schweitzer would add a fictitious character in this book about real events and characters, but perhaps Tanya was added as a creative way or interactive way to give more background information about the Russian side of what was going on, as opposed to stopping the story and having a narrator's monologue or inserting notes at the bottom of the pages. In Tanya, we see this perspective of those who wasn't for the monarchy, the exact opposite of those who was attending all of the monarchical events from our main character's perspective. Count von Lambsdorff. Count von Lambsdorff is a Russian count with German heritage. As a part of the Tsar's court, he met with Iokea and Poor and knew exactly who they were based on the kalo that was depicted on their diplomatic uniforms. He ends up inviting them to travel with him, and they end up being travel companions. Count von Griers is Alexander's soft-spoken foreign minister from Russia. He was responsible for sending one of their warships to Honolulu to give Kalakaua the Order of Alexander Nevsky, the highest decoration awarded by Russia to a foreign prince or statesman. He is an observer looking in. In the novel, he says, "Your country's welfare has interested us from the beginning," that is, from Captain Cook's discovery in 1778. And he and Iokea have a long discussion. In this discussion, he shows that he is not happy with the reciprocity treaty and how Hawaii is aligning themselves with America, but he does so in a more delicate way than the other countries did. I couldn't find definite pictures of the two of them, and so since they both represent Russia and are under Russia, I chose to put the Russian flag. Lauren Thurston is a Kingdom of Hawaii citizen who is the child of the first missionaries and who became a businessman as an adult. He is responsible for leading the events prior to the overthrow and for being the devious mastermind behind the overthrow itself. He is not favored by the Hawaiian community. Sanford Dole is a Kingdom of Hawaii citizen and also is a descendant of the first missionaries who became a lawyer as an adult. He was a part of the Committee of Safety who is responsible for the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. In the novel, he is seen as struggling with the planned illegal overthrow and later becomes president of Hawaii following the illegal overthrow. Queen Liliuokalani is the sister to King David Kalakaua and the last reigning monarch of Hawaii. She inherits the throne upon her brother's death in 1891. Liliuokalani leads a hard life after her brother passes away, proposing a new constitution and the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, both which would result in denial. She was imprisoned in her home and secluded from her people, all while losing her kingdom. It is her funeral that we see the main character, Iokea, attending at the beginning and the end of the novel. Queen Victoria is the Queen of England. Hawaii has a long-standing history with England and both countries' monarchs. Queen Victoria was good friends with Queen Liliuokalani and Queen Kapi'olani, and was not happy about the events occurring in Hawaii leading up to the overthrow of the kingdom. At her Diamond Jubilee, Queen Victoria has a conversation with Iokia, asking him if it was all worth it, which made him stammer with embarrassment. And this section can be found on pages 235 and 236. Section 5, Comparisons, will compare the main messages or points of the book to what we know or what we have learned in this class from lectures and readings, and if applicable, from other previous relevant classes. The coronation of the Tsar Alexander III. The coronation of the Tsar really showed the status that Hawaii was respected at on the international platform. This was a nice comparison to the savage-like natives that Hawaiians were looked at as a little over 100 years ago upon the arrival of Captain James Cook and his company. In just over 100 years, Hawaiians were able to re-establish good educational institutions, become literate in 2 foreign languages, English and the written language, and establish a monarchy on a very respected platform amongst other very powerful countries around the world. The way that Henry Poor feels about the missionaries' sons, I think, compared to the lecture, European Colonialism. It reminded me of that lecture because, like the Europeans that traveled and used their resources to their advantage, I feel like Henry Poor saw the same characteristics in the descendants of the original missionaries and was cautious of them throughout the entire novel. And we see now that it was for good reason. The Reciprocity Treaty was a dishonest move by the U.S. Knowing that such a treaty was against international law, they did it anyway, and Hawaii received backlash from it. I think that this compares to how President William McKinley handled the illegal overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. He knew it was wrong, but continued to forcefully make it happen anyway, for their own benefit. The conversation that Queen Victoria had with Iokia at her Diamond Jubilee compares to the conversation between Iokia and Count von Geers after the Reciprocity Treaty was signed. In both conversations, we see the level of respect that Hawaii had internationally and the amount of support that they had from dignitaries of all ranks. In both conversations, Iokia was embarrassed because he knew things were being handled wrongfully. The illegal overthrow of Hawaii, I think, compares to the long stand up on Mauna Kea on the island of Hawaii. In both situations, wrong was committed. Native people affected are standing their ground, some physically and some spiritually. An action was and is being taken in a peaceful manner, showing aloha aina. Both cases really emulate the concept of aloha aina, something that our ali'i and kings and queens really upheld and we follow today. The final comparison between Iokia and Tiresias's prophecy is a hopeful comparison for what happened to Samoa. As we learned in class, Samoa was the very first in the Pacific to re-establish their independence, and I think that the conclusion of the novel ends on a hopeful note in comparison to Samoa's fate. So why do we read this book for this class, and how it relates to our HAP focus? This book is important in understanding the history of modern Hawaii, the events that led up to and followed the illegal overthrow of Hawaii, and how we got to where we are today. It provides a clear understanding of worldly events that were going on at the time and why decisions were made based off of those events. I also like that the story comes from the perspective of someone who was present at these worldly events and gives us his side of what was happening and why things, including his own decisions, were being done. This book relates to our HAP focus because it gives us a clear understanding of regional issues rooted in Hawaii and gives us the perspective and experiences of those people. Through analysis, this book provides us with intellectual knowledge and promotes self-reflection no matter what part of the world each student comes from, both physically and genealogically. I think that this book was able to hit every learning objective under the HAP focus. And these are the learning objectives of the HAP focus under UH Manua. I feel like we as students are now able to clearly explain the intersection of Native Hawaiian issues with Asian issues, analyze those issues with the conceptual and ethical frameworks of the cultural perspectives, values, and worldviews of the indigenous people of Hawaii, integrate the histories, cultures, beliefs, arts, social and political and economic processes in our analysis of both Hawaii and Asia, and demonstrate respect and empathy as defined by the indigenous people of Hawaii in interpersonal and intergroup relationships, just like how we read that the king and queens did and continue to be role models to follow. In conclusion, it took me a while to get through the book and all of the lectures. Being a Native Hawaiian and being directly impacted by this story and history, it makes me sad and emotional every time I have to read, listen, or watch something about the illegal overthrow of our kingdom and the events that led up to it and followed it. Our monarchs were so strong, so humble, so dedicated to their people, and their reputations still live on. It makes me wonder if things had been different with one thought or if one decision had been different. If Dole decided to stand his ground, would we still be in this position? If Kalakaua hadn't signed the bayonet constitution, would things have been different? If Iokia hadn't continued to work for the provisional government after the fact, would the provisional government have succeeded as much as they did? Perhaps Iokia's hopefulness would have been a reality.
Hello, it's Winona, and I wanted to offer my final and personal thoughts on His Hawaiian Excellency. And so I first wanted to say that when I was younger, I was a huge Harry Potter fan, and I remember when the 7th book came out and we got Snape's backstory, and everyone started to think that he was a hero because, oh, he did this because he loved her and this and that. And I just never subscribed to that. I always defined him as a threat to both the wizarding world and to Hogwarts students. He was so awful that he was even a 13-year-old's biggest nightmare. He was Neville Longbottom's Bogart. And so I took that same logic and same judgment and applied it to a lot of the characters in this book. And regardless of the justifications of their actions, I just felt that the harm they imposed on Pacifica communities, of course, especially the Hawaiian community, outweighed anything that they did to try and redeem themselves. If I were to give my own ethical analysis of these characters, it would not have been with as much grace or philosophy as the one in the presentation. And that's because, again, I'm Filipino, so I work within a very anti-colonialist and anti-racist framework, and so one, that would have dismissed half the characters in the book anyway, but two, it would have made exploring the spectrum of these characters' morality to be incredibly emotionally taxing. And I'll even be the first to admit that there were parts of this book that I felt were pretty challenging to get through. I am a psych major, and my interest actually lies in the lasting effects of colonial mentality, so this book hit home, very close to home in many ways, and I didn't feel that any of the characters really embodied any of my values, and that too many of the characters stood for things that I am actively trying to work against. And I will say that I was pleasantly surprised and appreciative of how hopeful the book ended, or it ended on a very hopeful note, I should say. If you are someone who faces institutional violence, I will say, without trying to sound too cheesy, is that the most effective and, more importantly, sustainable way forward is to invest in community. And whatever strong reactions I had while reading the book stemmed from my love of community. And yeah, I thought the book had a very profound and just gracious ending.